Kevin O'Connor. Welcome to Built to Sell Radio.
Good to be here.
It's very rare I get to sell or get to talk to someone who has sold to a giant Fortune 500 company. In your case, you've done it twice. You sold a company to Google and you sold a company to Amazon. That is an incredible achievement. And I want to dig into the secrets to selling to a Fortune 500 company. Before we go there, though, I would love to just hear some of your philosophies around entrepreneurship. I mean, you've done it multiple times. You've invested in dozens of companies. I just love to sort of hear what you think your secret is and maybe what is a little different than is common sort of tropes or advice entrepreneurs may be used to hearing. So what's your secret to this game called entrepreneurship?
I guess there is no secret, right? I mean, I love Occam's razor, trying to figure out the simplest explanation for something. And as I look at business, I really just boil it down to how do you find a big problem? And then what is the best from the technology side? So how do you apply technology to solve that problem better than anyone else? And then how do you attract a sort of high IQ, I call them smart athletes, to help build it? So it's really that simple. I mean, I think we overcomplicate business. But at the end of the day, if you solve a problem better than anyone else, you create value. Common store value is money. People give you money. If you do it really, really well, you kick ass in it, then people give you a whole lot of money and then you create profits. So that's it.
I guess I see a lot of young entrepreneurs chasing the big idea, but not really being realistic about what it would entail to take on a giant, because these massive companies are well-resourced. They've got lots of smart people working for them. If the idea was that big, if the problem was that pervasive, clearly some other company would be attacking it, no?
So there's a lot to unpack there. One is, the toughest job about being in venture capital is figuring out who is visionary and who's delusional. So there's that part. So there's a lot of people.
What's the difference?
One you do really well, IPO, and the other one goes down the toilet. You are right there. You'd be surprised at how I mean, I love the obvious, sort of back to the simple. A lot of times there's big ideas that are just really, really, well, everything's obvious in hindsight. But a lot of times people aren't working on it. But we do, we kind of put companies, when we look at them, into three different areas. One is entrepreneurs often confuse. They'll look at a product from, let's say, Google or Microsoft and say, oh, this doesn't, Excel doesn't do this. We're going to do that. That's a feature. And you're going to get squashed. Like, there is no way Microsoft's going to let you, displace Excel because of a feature. The next one is it a product? And products are good. They don't have to be huge, but products are something that companies could acquire and sort of slap into their sales force. And then the next one is it an industry? And that's where you get into sort of the delusional versus visionary. And usually industries happen when there's a big disjoint within the market, like technology, where I always look at big mega trends like the PC or the internet or let's say AI now. It kind of resets the table. What big companies once had assets, let's say newspapers back in the internet days. So, their assets, what were their assets? Their assets were, they had the journalists, they had the printing presses, they had the distribution network. Internet comes along, all of a sudden those assets become liabilities. And nobody likes to write off assets. So, and they won't cannibalize their business. And now what's happened? All the newspaper industry, they pay you to take them over.
I heard an interview. I can't remember. To prep for this, I watched two interviews. One was, as I mentioned before, we hit record with Jason Calacanis on This Week in Startups. I also listened to a 9-year-old video of you giving a talk at the University of Santa Barbara, I believe, to a group of aspiring entrepreneurs, which was great. I loved it. And one of the things that came up in one of those two things was this concept of saga, and how you look for it in both entrepreneurs, but also employees. Can you kind of talk about that and what role that played for you in companies like DoubleClick and Graphics?
So you must have just read the article because I added the A. I didn't have a name for it. Well, I used to call it smart athletes. And then I discovered one other one probably 10 years ago, which is smart athletes with good attitudes. And that one is basically, well, let's start with the smart athlete. Smart, you can't teach IQ. So you just have to find people that have very high IQs. You don't have to be 180, but they have to be smart. Smart people can learn anything. I don't put that much emphasis on skills. I look at people that can solve problems. You learn skills to solve problems. You don't learn skills to solve problems. The other one is athlete. I just like competitive people. I don't have to play D1 sports or NFL, but did you compete on preferably a team sport like in high school? Were you busy or were you just playing video games? Athletes know they hate losing. It's not about the winning; it's about the fear of losing. And they know they have to put in 100 hours of hard grinding work in order to get sort of that hour of playing time. And then the attitude is, I just found people where they could be smart, they could be competitive. They didn't have a positive attitude. They didn't have when the startups are tough. Any type of small business is tough. And how did they have the grit? Did they have the attitude to get through it? Or were they quitters?
So it's smart athlete, good attitude is the acronym. Saga. Wonderful. One of the secrets to building. Can entrepreneurship be taught?
I don't think you can teach it to everybody. I think there's, I'd done research on it and just my own experience. I'd come up with sort of 10 attributes for what are good indicators of whether someone's an entrepreneur. And then, of course, if you score all 10, I would have everyone raise take the test and then raise their hand. And there'd always be one or two that scored 10. And then my final question is, are you delusional? Back to that delusional question. Because people never have all 10. But there are definitely characteristics you got to have. There's things that you can improve upon. But if you're not, if you don't have sort of a sense of urgency, if you don't have the grit, if you don't have sort of the charisma, it's going to be, it's tough. Yeah, it's all a game of probabilities. Even if you have your all 10, you're not guaranteed to be an entrepreneur, but your probability goes down goes up as you have more of those attributes, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I'd be curious. So grit's one of them. What are two or three of the other in the top 10 list?
Now I need to go pull it up. I mean, one of it is sort of like, it's the sense of urgency. Like I have to do it now. You take a look at it, like a lot of people who, whether it's a Bill Gates or a Mark Zuckerberg, they dropped out of college, dropped out of Harvard. There's that sense of urgency where I cannot wait. And I mean, I kind of did the same thing. I got accepted into the PhD program, and then 2 hours later decided to go start a company with my buddy because it was during the PC revolution. IQ is one of them. You got to be smart. The other one is being very objective. You have to have strong conviction, but you also have to be cognizant in when you get more data that perhaps your conviction was wrong, and so that's the sort of the delusional part is you've got to be able to look at it and say, you know what, I was wrong. We're going to pivot, or we're going to change our strategy slightly. So you had to be sort of, I don't know, very cold, very objective.
In the video that I watched, you told the audience a story about growing up. You said you kind of grew up in a fairly kind of sort of middle class life, and then you moved to Detroit, and you saw a whole other world that you hadn't sort of been exposed to. To what degree did that experience make you a better entrepreneur?
Well, I went to high school in Detroit, so I still stayed on the suburbs. How did it make me a better entrepreneur? I didn't even know what an entrepreneur was. Didn't know, never heard of the word. So back then, I wasn't. I was really more of an inventor back then, which it really is another word for entrepreneur. But I was as a kid, I'd go around on garbage night and collect TVs and invent stuff. Um, I invented something talking through a beam of light, which is how all communications happens today. But Bell Labs, I believe it was the first inventor. But I would come up with sort of these inventions. I love to make mixed chemicals to make explosives. If I was successful, I love to blow things up. So I was just always a tinkerer. Love to experiment. I love to invent. And then really it was Bill Gates. When Bill Gates and the PC revolution was going along, and I was like, geez, that's just inventing.
How did the idea for DoubleClick come about?
So I took a bunch of time off. It sold our company, and a long story, but so it sold the first company. Dwight Merriman and I came up with 100 different product ideas. It was the beginning of the internet. Our belief was that the internet was going to be really big, and it was just applying this technology. Like, what were the big problems? And we came up with 100 ideas. Probably 10 of them were really good. 10 of them would all turned into billion-dollar companies. But the original idea was that I wanted to do subscriptions, sort of like cable TV. You buy a sports package. I thought that was going to be the model of the internet. And one day Dwight goes, it seems like advertising is bigger than subscriptions. Maybe we should do advertising. And we were like, that's it. That was the idea. We believed that it was going to be sort of a highly fragmented media. We thought there'd be 1,000 big websites out on the internet. People thought we were crazy. Now of course there's millions of websites, but we thought it was going to be a highly fragmented media, but that we didn't know anything about advertising. So I went and got 2 books on brand marketing and direct response. And as I was reading it, I was like, holy crap, we can do all this. We can take this theory that they could never do in disconnected media like print or TV. We could actually do all this on the internet. That was it.
And it was really, it pioneered the entire internet advertising game. How did the acquisition by Google come about?
So I do have to correct one thing. We didn't sell to Google. I didn't sell to Google. We were a public company, and we decided to sell the company for a variety of reasons. Mostly it was, we had kind of 3 separate businesses, and the businesses need to be spun off, and it's just hard to do in a public company. So we had basically an auction, and Google was there, but Google didn't buy it at that time. They decided to pay, 3 times the price 3 years later. Hellman Friedman, a private equity firm, actually bought it. But, Google was at the table. I don't know. I ran into the guy that was there and decided not to buy it years later. And he told me that they didn't realize that we were a technology company. They thought we were an advertising company. They had a real thing about, even though Google is probably the world's largest advertising company, they didn't want to be seen as an advertising company. It was very strange. But 3 years later, I guess they changed their mind. And it's I've been told it's the most successful acquisition they've done, and the Department of Justice agrees, and they're trying to break it up, break it off. Good luck.
Yeah, now they're on the other side of the M&A world. So you sold to private equity. I did not realize that. I came into this thinking that you'd sold to Google. So you sold to private equity, who in turn sold it to Google a few years later.
Yes. And I was no longer with the company at that time. It was David Rosenblatt had taken over as CEO.
Got it. And okay, so tell me a little bit more about what you learned through that process about large strategic acquirers. It sounds like optics, in the case of Google, they, quote, didn't want to be in the advertising business. Like, for me as a layperson, that sounds so superficial. Like, did you really not go beyond the first page of the prospectus or the deck to know that this company was much more comprehensive than just a, quote, marketing business? Like, is it really that superficial? Is there decision-making like a Google or an Apple or an Amazon? Are they really that superficial?
Well, I'd say that there's 2 things. One is I've never started a company that I thought we would sell. So it was always more build to keep. It was build to be, like build a great company. So our mantra has always been that. We never talk about exit strategies or anything else. If you build a great company, a great product, solve a big problem, you have options. There's tons of options. You go public, you get bought. I mean, there's, what you want to do is create optionality. In this case, we did reach the point where it was like, okay, this is the time for the reasons we discussed, to sell the company. The problem you get into is that you have two sides of a deal. You have a buyer and a seller, and somehow, ideally you meet a buyer who is actively looking to acquire something that you are selling. That's rarely the case. Most of the times I've been involved with acquisitions, it's never one meeting. It's or one period of time. It usually spans 1 or 2 years. Because a lot of times, you sort of see an industry evolving in a certain way. You get to that point quicker than the person who's buying you. The same thing happened with Graphic. We had talked to all those companies multiple times over, I think, a 2 or 3 year time period, and we had to convince them that our vision was the right vision. 3 of the 4 companies believed in our vision. The other one, Apple, did not.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because in one of the interviews I read, you shared a story about the head of engineering at Apple and how that individual killed their interest in Graphic. And I think it might be interesting for our listeners to hear that story, because many of them assume that, well, the CEO of the acquirer is going to make the final decision and the influencers probably aren't that important. In this case, it was the head of engineering. Can you tell that story?
It's somewhat of a complicated story, but Graphic was about, we created vertical search engines, and we were, so think of Zillow or Kayak, but for 500 different things. And so we were collecting a massive amount of information, and Google came out with something called a knowledge graph. And the knowledge graph is basically connecting information together semantically. So you can connect concepts together. And it turned out we had the world's largest knowledge graph. And so when all these companies like Apple with Siri and Google with Google, and Amazon with Alexa were creating these personal assistants, these personal assistants were you could ask questions and it could respond to you. We all use them. Our belief is that they were really focused on how do you understand questions? How do you understand human language? And our approach was more like Jeopardy, which is we have the answers. It doesn't matter if you can understand the question if you don't have the answer, it's meaningless. So we have the answers. And it's easy once you have the answers to understand a question. So we had talked to them years before, and we were trying to convince them like this is the way to go. And they're like, this is too ugly. We're going to use AI to sort of scrape the internet and get all the answers off the internet. Well, you have a lot of garbage on the internet. So people were giving really bad answers. And Apple was very committed to, we're only going to use AI. We're not going to do this hard work of getting the answers, getting the data. But the real turning point was during a hackathon. Dylan had, just within a few hours, ripped the brains out of Alexa and put in a skill, they call it, and put our brains in. And they filmed it. Ivan filmed it and sent it to Jeff Bezos. And Jeff watched it and sent it to his group and said, who the hell are these guys? How are they ahead of all of us in answering questions? So that was like the ultimate pivot. That was not the purpose of the company. We didn't start the company for that. But we were able to realize that here's 3 companies competing to become the best at answering questions and responding like a human. And Google came to the realization at the last minute. It's along the person who was doing corporate development was on vacation. So they wanted to buy us too. Apple, we thought, was going to buy us. And they called me up on a Saturday when I thought they were going to give us an offer, and they basically said, we're not going to give you an offer. I'm like, well, why the hell did you call me on a Saturday? And then we actually had another offer from a Korean company. I didn't think you could have an offer that was worse than no, but this one was worse than no. It was so bad.
What made it worse than no?
I thought slavery was illegal. I was going to be basically become an indentured servant for a Korean company for like years and received nothing. It was just a horrible deal. It was the most.
What was the legal structure that made it horrible?
I, it basically took away all my equity and made me work for like low wages and nothing. So it was indentured servitude. So
that was a non-starter. What'd you think of the Amazon offer?
Amazon offer was good. It was good. It was really good for the employees. It was good for investors. Good company. I learned a lot. I didn't think I'd learn anything at Amazon. I was like, I'm going to go to a big company. This is going to suck. I'll do my year. Really good company. As I tell people in startups, people always love to nag on big companies. Like, look, big companies become big for a reason. It's because they're good. They're good at something. So small companies remain small because they're usually not very good. So.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting segue to a part of the conversation I wanted to have with you, which is around, a lot of our listeners, as I said to you before we hit record, were, they're between $1 million and $10 million in annual revenue. They're the king of their little patch, right? Or the queen of their little patch. And they've got great margins and they've got a great lifestyle. And, I think from time to time, they're tempted to put the gas pedal down and build a much larger company that would likely require outside capital. What advice would you have for an entrepreneur who's at that fork in the road, trying to decide, do I keep a lifestyle business, ski on the weekend and have a great, life, but maybe not meet my potential, or hit the gas?
Well, I mean, look, there's a lot of different businesses, and a lot of your listeners are probably different from maybe the industry I was in, which was, there is nothing wrong with a small business, but there's a difference between a small business and a large business. And, there's, if you own a restaurant, it's a small business. If you own a plumbing supply, it can be a small business. But in technology, it is a bit of a winner take all. And so you don't have much of a choice. Sure, there are, my first company, we probably should have kept it a small business and a highly profitable business. You tend to get capped out. But if you don't win your market, every market devolves into usually three players. The number one player, all the spoils go to the number one player. So you want to make sure that you either get bought by the number one player or the number two player to make them number one. But if you want to, if you're in an industry where you have to get big in order to survive, you're going to have to bring on capital. And I think a lot of, I give this speech a lot about dilution. People are always worried about getting diluted, or they're worried about control. On the control side is that you're CEO, you're the founder. Don't confuse ownership with control. I mean, you control the company. You're running the company. Investors' worst nightmare is having to come in and replace you and take over a company. That's a bad investor business model. So that rarely happens. When you hear stories like that, and you'll hear stories, there's usually a pretty good reason for it. CEO is not doing a good job. So I think people are probably unjustly paranoid about that. And then dilution is just a meaningless. I end up with 5% of DoubleClick by the time it's sold to private equity firm. Do you want to own 100% of nothing, or do you want to own 5% of a billion-dollar company? It's really about, is your value worth it? So the challenge I always give companies, like, okay, we're going to invest. Typical dilution in a company is 20%. Do you think that this money that we're going to give you, this, let's say $1 million, is going to increase your value more than 20%? The answer is yes, then it's a no-brainer. You take the money. If the answer is no, then neither one of us should be doing the deal. You're just going to put it in the bank and get 2%. So it's really about, is this equity going to make? This investment going to make your equity worth more than the dilution.
This is a conversation you probably had more recently because you're having exited from Graphic and sold DoubleClick and so forth. You've now got a venture capital firm, SCOP. Maybe just touch on the thesis of your venture capital firm. What makes it different as a firm?
One, all the partners are operators, so we come from the shoes of the entrepreneur. So we understand it. We're not. There's a lot of sort of, you can flip these around. Harvard undergrad, Stanford MBA, great schools, all for it. But they tend, a lot of them don't have necessarily the sort of operate. They've never built a company, and they don't necessarily empathize. Sometimes I think the industry is a little bit too spreadsheet oriented. We tend to look at SaaS companies, AI companies that have $1 million in revenue for a bunch of different reasons. For a company to get to $1 million means you've got product market fit, you've been able to assemble a team, you've convinced someone to give you money, and most importantly, you've got customers that are actually giving you money. And so we think that de-risks the opportunity greatly. But those companies, what they don't have is they typically don't have a executive team. They're going to be weak in some area, whether it's marketing or say a CTO, and they need help. They need help to try to figure out, how do I get to the growth stage? So maybe they don't have the unit economics quite right, but maybe they haven't figured out the LTV to CAC is too low. So how do we improve that process? So the company's not quite scalable yet. They have an opportunity, but it's not predictably scalable, which is really the growth stage.
Got it. And you're looking for, obviously, ideas in AI and tech and SaaS where there's a big opportunity and a big problem to go solve, where the market share. When you invest, I've never run a company that has a VC backer. What's the structure that you would use if it's a company with a couple $1 million in sales, so they've got product market fit, and you're investing? What would the structure look like?
I mean, the structure is typically, we're looking for 10% initial ownership. So let's say the going rates are like, let's say 8 to 12 times revenue AR. We typically would have a board seat. The boards, I always tell people, the boards, this is, it's like 2% governance. It's good to have good governance within a company. It just makes governance, to us, is like, it's the foundation. You get a shaky foundation, you run into lots of problems later. But it's mostly about strategy. It's mostly about, management has ideas. They have so here's the strategy, and we'll probe. Like, did you consider this? We've had other companies have had success here. Don't do that. Don't go in the basement. Everyone who's ever gone in the basement and never come out. Don't do it. And then,
sorry, what's the basement?
Kind of a horror movie. You always see the horror movies. Don't go in the basement. They always go in the basement.
Oh, I see.
Never come out. Half of them still want to go check out what's in the basement. So it's really just, I don't know. It's accelerating where they know their market. We have a lot of pattern recognition across a large number of companies. There's some obvious mistakes that they can sort of avoid, but really to kind of push have you considered this? A lot of companies think they're constrained by capital. I always like to challenge companies. Well, forget about capital. Let's say money is infinite. What would you do? Like, how do you win this market? And then you sort of figure out, okay, our job is to go get the capital and help them achieve it.
And the shares that you get are preferred shares. Is that correct?
Yes.
And maybe just describe for listeners who've never gone through a capital raise, the difference between, say, common shares that the entrepreneur would hold and preferred shares that a VC would get in return for its cash.
So in simplest terms, you think of it as sort of the last money in is the first money out. So if you invest $1 million into a company at a $10 million valuation, and the company sells for $2 million, you don't get your 10% of that $2 million. You would take your $1 million. Now, if the company sells for more than $10 million, it would convert. So it's the preferred investor always gets their money. When I say always, what you agree to when you do the deal isn't always what happens at the acquisition stage, but you typically at least get your money back. Otherwise, you convert it into common stock, and then you get more than your money back. You get a good return.
And what's the justification if an entrepreneur balks at that and says, "Well, why would you get special treatment over us?" What's the industry say when an entrepreneur balks at giving preferred shares?
Well, it's standard, so it's tough to go against the standard. They're not going to get a better deal. The other one is this: like, we're putting cash in, we're putting real money in, and what's the other one? Yeah, don't you think there's entrepreneurs always going to think that their company is going to be worth more. So if they're saying it's not going to be worth more, like if you believe your company's worth a lot of money, you shouldn't be worried at all. It's a sort of a meaningless thing. Where I think companies do get into trouble. And by the way, I'm not sure I disagree with. Well, I'm not sure you disagree with me, but I think there's probably decent arguments on the other side of why it should all be common. But nobody will do it. Yeah, you probably get angels that'll do it, but you'll never see a VC. A lot of my requirements where they have to have common. When you get into trouble is when you start getting into participation, where some people are doing 3 times participation. So that means I put $1 million in, I get at least $3 million out. Or they have accrued dividends where it's $1 million, but let's say it's 10%. It's $1 million, 100,000. It's $1 million, whatever, 210,000 year 2. So it can very quickly get away, and I think that's a misalignment of management with investors. We don't do that.
So that's called an accrued dividend.
Yeah, there's dividends. There's always some dividend thing, but there's a participation, the accrued dividend.
Yeah, and again, a participation at like a 3-to-1 would be the VC gets 3 times the money out.
Yeah.
Before you see a penny, kind of thing.
And that's a bit of like most VCs know. Again, we're talking about sort of tech companies. Everyone thinks about, it's going to be IPO, it's going to be $1 billion outcome. Most outcomes are between 10 to, let's say, 50 million. And so VCs know that founders always think they're going to be $1 billion. So there's a bit of a confidence arbitrage. And so the VCs know that that's actually a really good deal. So there's certain percent of VCs that kind of play in that, let's say, more aggressive area. Most VCs are actually it's a pretty standard term sheet. It's pretty fair. It's pretty reasonably fair to the founder.
What other gotchas are there? Like if you were coaching a young entrepreneur about to take a first round of investment from a VC firm, how would you have them scrutinize the term sheet? Like what terms are they looking for in addition to the ones we've already spoken about?
I mean, those are the big ones. You got sort of rights that the companies, or blocking rights that the preferred investors may have. So those usually get scaled back a bit.
What's a blocking right? What does that mean?
It's like you have to get approvals for increasing salaries, taking on debt, taking on additional equity. You have approval rights that preferred has to agree to it. Those usually aren't that bad. I think people probably get more worried about it than it should. Again, sort of what's on the paper and what happens in real life are often different. So very rarely, anytime you're going to sell the company, the board's going to have a conversation, and you look at all the facts, and and you may give in on certain things. You may say, okay, well, I had a blocking right where I have to approve over $100 million and you're selling it for 50. The investor is not going to shoot themselves in the head if they think that 50 million outcome is the best outcome they're going to get. The one that probably makes founders sweat the most is you want to have some portion of their equity. Some people are very egregious, but let's say 50% of their vested equity. Most founders just give themselves stock, right? They have the stock. And then you ask them, wait a second, we want to restrict 50% of that stock. So it'll vest over 4 years. That freaks out founders. Why it's a really, really good reason is I have seen more often than not the original founding team fall apart. So let's say you have 3 founders with 33% of the old 100% of the company, 33% each. And one of them just says, hey, I have all my stock. I'm out of here. I don't need to, or they have a fight and, they're all pissed off at each other. And one of them says, screw this, I'm out. Now you got 30% of dead stock. And the other founders are kind of screwed. They have to do all the work. They get the exact same outcome. So, we always like them to vest the stock over time. And we argue it's good for you. Hey, if you're not considering leaving, it's not a problem. But if you do, it's going to cost.
Describe what vesting is for folks who may be hearing that term for the first time.
So vesting is either through a stock option, which is the right to buy a share of stock, or it's through restricted stock. So pretty much the same thing. Restricted stock means you get the stock, but you get over a period of time. So a typical vesting schedule is, let's say I offer you 1,000 shares. Typically, it would vest. There's a cliff of 1 year. So I get 25% of those shares, 250 shares after year 1. And then every month after that, I would get 1/36 of those shares. So I invest over time. So I don't get the 1,000 shares up front. I get the 1,000 shares if I last the 4 years. And they're great for 2 reasons. One is it's a high transaction cost if you quit. If you decide to quit, okay, it's going to cost us to replace you. And you're probably less likely to quit because you've got this carrot out there. So those are the big, the main reasons.
So to be clear, when you invest in a company, you'll often say, look, I know you own 100% of the company today, or the 3 founders have divided up, but we want to now, even though you've already reached $1 million in sales and you got product market, we now want to say you don't own that stock anymore. It's got to vest. And I understand the rationale completely, because you don't want one of the founders to leave, nor do you want the if it's just a one-person founder to go, one company founder to go. But that's the quid pro quo that you ask for in return for investing.
Yes.
Got it. That's super helpful. The other criticism we've heard a little bit about VCs, and I just love to have you react to it, is this idea that, before venture capital, I was happy hitting singles, like I was happy hitting single, maybe the odd double, but like I was conservative. I wanted and now that I've got VC, that they're really encouraged me to take the big swings and hit the home runs. And now I'm conflicted because I'd be happy with a single, but they want the home run. What reaction do you have to that sort of? You've heard it, I'm sure, before many times.
No, it's a great question. More complicated answers. So you do get, again, in tech, you do need to get big. So we do want founders that are not looking for an exit, but looking to build something substantial. But that's not every founder. And there's nothing wrong with, I think the venture community's got, in order to get these big funds, and the funds are huge. There's so many venture capital funds, but there's some big ones. The whole business model is predicated on getting like this massive hit. And I'm not sure I agree with that. I mean, it's great to get them. It's highly improbable. So I tend to look for, we tend to look for just build a great company, optionality, but nothing wrong with a $100 million company. I think that a lot of these firms put too much money into companies too quick, and they scale an unscalable product. So it's the old adage, hey, I lose money on every item I sell. I'll make it up in volume. So all they do is end up, burning even more money, replicating their mistakes all over the place. So, SCOP is about scalable opportunities. We really try to hone in the business plan, the unit economics to get to the growth stage. Once you get to the growth stage, then you can take a large chunk of money. But the top three reasons that companies fail is one, they don't actually solve any known problem. So it's just cool tech. And we see lots of that. We're going to see a lot of that in AI. We saw a lot of it in the .com. It just doesn't make any sense. Number two is they don't raise enough money. So they get, let's say we have founders, they're so paranoid about dilution that they just won't raise money. And then they, something happens, something bad happens. There's always bad stuff happening. SVB goes out of business, and there's a war. It's just bad shit happens all the time. So not having enough money is just dumb. And then the third reason, too much money. I think too much money, people think they won. They think I won't name the firm, just gave me $100 million. Boy, we crushed this thing. And then they go out and they blow it all because they have a crappy business model. They haven't figured it out yet. What they also don't realize, back to that preferred stock problem, you take someone like, what was the scooter company, like Lime or something like that? Lime? Out of LA.
I'm not sure, but keep going. I'm familiar with Lime. I think most people know electronic scooters running around cities.
I'm going to make up some numbers here, but I think they raised something like I don't know, $500 million at $1 billion valuation or something like that. And they're like, that's great. You now have to have a company worth over $500 million, which is highly improbable, and it's not. I think people got the original comment got crushed. So raising too much money, not a good idea.
This is this notion of the deathcorns that you've talked about a little bit, that these companies go, especially 2001, it's 2021, 2022, they're just astronomical valuations. And now they've got to kind of grow into those. And in many cases, they're not. Yeah.
I think those are great examples where they're hot one day. And I think humility is, I really pushed on this at DoubleClick. We're in business to stay in business. This was during the .com craze, and it was insane. People were raising money. You have a concept, boom, here's $10 million. It was really staying focused on the customer, really staying focused on solving the problem, really staying focused on, we're a business. Our business is to stay in business. It's being humble, being paranoid. Andy Grove, paranoid survive at Intel. Bad things happen, and competitors come out of nowhere. Government regulation comes. Money dries up for a decade, like it did after the .com crisis. So in some ways, I'm like you. I'm actually fairly conservative. But once you have a strong conviction in something, and that it's statistically highly probable that you can scale it, you throw money at it, you scale the crap out of it, you win. But only that.
I think that is a great place to leave it. I know your time is precious. Kevin, if people want to reach out to you on social media, what's the best medium to do that on?
LinkedIn. Probably we have Scott LinkedIn as well. I'm there as well.
Great. So we'll put your LinkedIn profile, all the contact information for SCOP in the show notes at Built to Sell. Kevin, thanks for doing
it. ScottVC.com, and I'm at Kevin at ScottVC.com.
Oh, fantastic. We've got the direct email. There you go. So you guys can email Kevin directly if you like. I appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Thanks, John. It's fun.